Hello, welcome to Archaeology 101. I'm going to be looking at something a bit different in today's topic, which is a documentary which Netflix released in May of this year called The Secrets of the Neanderthals. I think it's a really good documentary. It's one I'm actually interested about. It's not about aliens or about the pyramids, which every other archaeology documentary is about. Whilst I do think it's great, I do think there is very much that could have been improved, and I thought I'll add some more context into that. So I hope you enjoy The Secrets of the Neanderthals, but with context. For the sake of those who haven't seen the documentary, it largely follows Dr. Emma Pomeroy and other researchers from the University of Cambridge. The excavation team were working in Shanidar Cave, which is in the Kurdish part of Iraq. Archaeological works have occurred at Shanidar Cave since the 1960s, mostly by Ralph Selecki. And within the cave, it was revealed over successive research digs 10 different Neanderthal skeletons. The documentary records the historic occasion of another Neanderthal being uncovered. This is the 11th Neanderthal to be discovered at the Shanidar Cave site, Shanidar Z. Although the documentary was filmed in 2020, Shanidar Z was first revealed about 2017 and successfully removed from the site. If you'd like more detail about the excavation in Shanidar Z, I will go into it, but you can go and read their open access journal, which is in Antiquity, and I'll provide a link to that. And also there's a follow-up paper on Shanidar 4, or colloquially named the Flower Burial. There was an open access paper in 2023, and I'll discuss both those papers, but if you'd like to go see the actual papers themselves, I'll put them in the description. Let's get into Shanidar Z. Shanidar Z was found 7 meters below the ground in a completely flattened state. The skull alone comprised 200 pieces. What you don't really get from the documentary is the technical nature of the excavation and just how difficult it actually was to excavate the bones of Shanidar Z. Dr. Pomeroy in her various articles on the internet elucidates this a bit more, and she describes Shanidar Z as having bones the consistency of a wet biscuit. Horrible. If you were excavating, say, a medieval skeleton in optimum conditions to both clean it and lift it, that would take an experienced archaeologist maybe a day and a half, maybe 2 days. But the excavation of Shanidar Z, it took Dr. Pomeroy weeks in sauna-like conditions below the ground. That process would reduce me to tears. Moreover, the pace at which Shanidar Z was actually recovered is much slower, and it really dates back to the dig season from 2016, where bits of Shanidar Z were discovered, and then it was realised that there was probably more Neanderthal remains here, so the archaeologists went back between 2017 and 2020, and most of Shanidar Z was revealed and removed by the 2020 dig season, which the documentary records. The 200 skull fragments, after they were stabilised with a stabilising agent, they were painstakingly pieced back together by Dr. Lucia Lopez-Pollin in the lab. She reproduced the skull that we know today, and it's that of an older lady, possibly in her mid to late 40s, and this was deduced through dental analysis. However, to be a little bit critical of dental analysis, it's not the most accurate form of aging an individual, especially not Neanderthals, who used their teeth much more actively than we do. They may have used their teeth to hold things like hides in their mouths, and then they would be free to process that with tools with their hands. And this would add much more wear onto the teeth, making it seem that Shanidar Z was actually older than she really was. So perhaps there will be more aging techniques used on Shanidar Z, which would actually put her age a little bit earlier on, maybe in her earlier 40s or late 30s. The documentary goes into how the face of Shanidar Z was reconstructed from the now almost complete skull, and they do this by introducing the Kennis brothers, who are twins from the Netherlands, and they make most of the more recent famous archaeological reconstructions. If you go into Google and type in any human ancestor reconstruction, there's a very good chance it was made by the Kennis brothers. We do have to remember that this is an artistic impression, but it is a good one, and the Kennis brothers do have a lot of practice with this, so this is a very good indication of the more or less the general features of what Shanidar Z looked like. One of my main criticisms about this documentary is how much emphasis is placed on the head and face of Shanidar Z, and how such little attention is placed onto the rest of the postcranial skeleton. This simple but effective illustration of how Emma Pomeroy thinks Shanidar Z was positioned indicates that she was almost positioned in a sub-sleeping sort of style, with her left hand on the left side of her face. And you can see the skeleton on the left hand side of the screen, see that it is largely articulated. However, you will also notice that much of the right hand side and the legs are missing. And the story to that is some of the bones may have gotten mixed up with an older excavation, perhaps with Shanidar 6. So we hopefully will see Shanidar Z reunited in future. But I would like to stress how rare it is to find an articulated Neanderthal, especially when considering the last Neanderthal to be discovered at Shanidar was 50 years ago. The documentary doesn't touch on this, and there's largely not much discussion within the academic papers either, but there has been a little bit of preliminary research into whether Shanidar Z was put into a cut grave. This is an age-old question on whether Neanderthals buried their dead. Most of the discussion up to this point has been inconclusive because most excavating Neanderthals were done years and years ago, and there wasn't much research done into the stratigraphy of those Neanderthals, and we can't really answer whether they were buried or just simply left in a convenient place. But the preliminary research involves micromorphology, which looks at the microstratigraphy of where Shanidar Z was found, and it suggests that Shanidar Z was put into a cut into a soft water channel, and this is very exciting because it at least hints at a cut grave. I will perhaps wait for a full paper on this analysis before I'm completely convinced that this is an example of a Neanderthal burial, but this is very encouraging evidence that Neanderthals did indeed bury their dead. One other interesting thing about the potential burial layer of Shanidar Z was this exceptionally rare find of a large chert flake, which was recovered from the ribs of Shanidar Z, but had not originally been directly associated with the bones. Rather, it had started higher up in the layers above Shanidar Z and worked its way down. But this flake appears to have been worked, and it had also snapped at some point. The paper only briefly refers to this stone tool, but it does hint at some importance of its inclusion near to the body of Shanidar Z. I can only hazard a guess, but this may be along the lines of grave goods or some other, possibly, dare I say it, ritual function. I think it's very important to emphasise that Shanidar Z has so much research potential. The research so far has only scratched the surface, and it's been fairly superficial. But in other talks on YouTube, for example, I found a talk where Dr. Pomeroy states that DNA analysis has not been done for any of the Shanidar skeletons, and Shanidar Z in particular is actually quite a good candidate for DNA analysis, despite it being in such a bad initial condition. But Shanidar Z has importantly preserved petrous bones, which are the little bones at the back of your ears, and this helps to preserve DNA, and so she may be subject to DNA analysis in future, and we'll be able to look at a whole swathe of Neanderthals that have never been researched in this way before. Now, Dr. Pomeroy did caveat this with the fact that ancient DNA does not survive well in warm climates like where Shanidar Z has come from in Kurdistan, Iraq, but only time will tell if there is any DNA left within Shanidar Z, and that will be incredibly exciting. There is, of course, the rest of Shanidar Z's skeleton to ID as well, so more and more of her will actually come together, and we'll get a more complete picture of what Shanidar Z looked like when they find the rest of her skeletal collection, which will hopefully be soon. But I hope that gives you an insight into how much interesting stuff there is to come from Shanidar Z. Moving on to the rest of Shanidar, what the documentary doesn't really detail is much about the other 10 Neanderthals that were found within the cave system, with the exception of Shanidar 4. This famous skeleton caught the world's attention in the mid-20th century, where it's thought that flower pollen associated with the skeleton was an example of deliberate placement of flowers around the body. This theory has shown to be incorrect. The theory did, however, aid in the reinterpretation of Neanderthals as, instead of slow, dumb creatures, into very intelligent, feeling, thinking creatures just like us. The documentary covers very briefly how the dig team at Shanidar also looked into reinterpreting the analysis of the flower burial, Shanidar 4, and they mostly discussed the effects of burrowing mammals like Gerds who may have brought in contaminants of pollen and those mixed in with the skeletons, and then that got brought up to Ralph Selecki, who confused that for being deposited by Neanderthals rather than through natural means. The dig team here actually go into more detail in their academic paper, which is headed by Hunt and his team, and they also discuss the observations of numerous bee burrows and other insect burrows around the area that Shanidar 4 was found. So clearly there was actually a number of avenues that pollen could have gotten in and contaminated Shanidar 4. Although this reanalysis may be quite boring to many people, it doesn't prove that Neanderthals put flowers with Shanidar 4. In fact, again, it reaffirms that this is through natural processes, but it's the fact that they did good archaeology, and now we can definitively say that contaminant pollen likely came through multiple different natural avenues, such as burrowing bees and other insects. The documentary falls down from this point and it loses focus when going on to try and talk about other aspects of Neanderthals. So I'm going to try and help that documentary along by providing more explanation and context where it's required. One of the more bizarre smash cuts, and quite a grisly one at that, is to two researchers who are just slicing up a cow carcass with stone tools. And the reason they're doing that, what might seem random and very grisly, is actually a very useful piece of archaeology called experimental archaeology. And the benefit of going through such processes with traditional stone tools is to be able to analyse how the stone tool cuts the bones. You'll be able to examine the cut marks on the bones and compare the experimental bones with archaeological samples, and that might help track down as to why a bone or how a bone has been cut, and also with what kind of tool was used to create that cut. The documentary then goes to haphazardly move on to other Neanderthal sites around Europe, and one of the ones that they bring up is Krapina Cave, which you can find in Croatia, and they particularly reference this one because of the cannibalistic practices that occurred there, so let's explore that in some more detail. Krapina Cave is an internationally renowned site, and it contains lots of Neanderthal bones. The estimate for the number of individuals represented at Krapina Cave is between 20 and 82, and that's such a varied number because of the quality of the remains. They're just so broken up and so fragmentary, it's very hard to narrow down quite how many individuals they represent, but between 20 and 82 is the number we have. Why this gruesome practice occurred has been the subject of continuous back and forth debate. Was it Neanderthals actively hunting and eating other Neanderthals? Some kind of mortuary ritual where dead relatives, friends were skinned, or perhaps a combination of all of these things? The behaviour demonstrated in the individuals from Shanidar compared to those of Krapina Cave seems to be quite different. If it was that the individuals at Krapina Cave were slaughtered just to be eaten as opposed to a mortuary ritual, that's in complete opposition to those at Shanidar who have been placed there and clearly show evidence of being cared for in their lifetime. Elderly people, infirm people who had horrific injuries, they're all represented in the Shanidar cave system, which is opposite to that of Krapina Cave. The documentary then tries to transition into some of the more weirder stuff that Neanderthals do, if cannibalism isn't weird enough already. But they go on to the case study of Bruniquel Cave, which is a cave system in southwestern France, which is possibly home to the most unique Neanderthal site in the world. In the doc, there is a brief scene of two French researchers going around the cave system and giving some synopsis on the circular features constructed from stalagmites and stalactites, or speleofax as they've been called. But they only lightly brush on their Neanderthal origins, so let's delve into it further and its importance as well, and how the conclusions about Bruniquel Cave were reasoned. The structures were discovered in the 1990s by cavers, and French archaeologists soon began to research the cave and the structures, but due to complications it wouldn't be until 2013 that much analysis was able to be performed on it, and in 2016 the main paper on Brunekell Cave was released. There are 6 structures in the cave, and they were constructed from approximately 400 speleofacs, equating to around 2 tons, and they're situated 300 metres from the cave entrance. The researchers took core samples from the speleofacs that made up the structures and used uranium series dating to identify the approximate age of the structures, which is around 176,500 years old. This is quite an old date. It's well beyond the scope of when Homo sapiens colonised Europe, but the structures themselves are fairly ambiguous in what they were for. All of the structures at one time had been exposed to fire, and some burnt material such as animal bone was retrieved from these burnt areas. In fact, the fires were situated mostly within the structures than on the surrounding cave floor itself. Therefore, it seems likely that these structures did embody some sort of domestic structure within the cave system, perhaps some sort of shelter. But the authors of the 2016 paper did very briefly query if there was some non-functional purpose behind them, which means, of course, was it ritual? Overall, there is very limited available data online about this site, so I can only presume that further research is forthcoming, which could perhaps produce more evidence on the purpose behind these structures. At the very beginning of the documentary, Patrick Stewart says that the Neanderthals suddenly disappear, and then there are some vague references to their extinction towards the end of the documentary, but this isn't talked about in detail. This topic is something that has only just begun to have proper scientific research into it, and therefore it's still very much open to interpretation. But let's go over some of the main theories, which would be a good way to round off this video. Neanderthal extinction was probably not down to one particular element, but was likely down to a variety of different stressors. So Neanderthals disappeared from the archaeological record around 39,000 years ago. One of the last surviving Neanderthal populations existed in Gibraltar, which the documentary actually does go to, and they talk to Clive Finlayson there, and he talks about Neanderthals of Gorham Cave very briefly, but doesn't talk about any of the Neanderthal art and doesn't really talk about things like the shaped eagle talons and stuff like that. So there was very much to be desired from that aspect. But Gibraltar was what would have been the last refugia for Neanderthals. They were relatively free from interactions from other groups of hominins at this southerly outcrop. And this probably also included freedom from other Neanderthals, and that may have been where the species ran into problems. The Neanderthals were always thought to have existed in small dispersed groups, which may have had limited contact with one another, and that meant very low genetic turnover and things like inbreeding, which caused the population to be infertile and also more vulnerable to disease, so these problems tend to compound. Coming together with new hominin groups may also have brought other problems, such as exposure to other diseases, of which Neanderthals had no immunity to. There are some vague specifics on this in terms of paleogenetics, and we're in the early days of this science, but this could have included viral infections like H. pylori, which caused stomach ulcers, and various types of herpes viruses, for example. If a particular bacteria had jumped from Homo sapiens to Neanderthals, we wouldn't necessarily see that in the archaeological record, as bacteria do not survive very well in it, whereas viruses are a little bit more hardy and do survive a bit better, so there is some bias to viral infection as opposed to bacterial. When Neanderthals would breed with other hominin groups, the offspring was not always fertile, which could have caused more problems down the line as more intermixing with other hominin groups came out, and Neanderthals may have simply bred out of existence through successive hybridization. Quite an outdated hypothesis today is the perception that Neanderthals were hunted to extinction by Homo sapiens, who arrived in Europe at the latest count about 45,000 years ago. If this dating is accurate, it suggests that there was an overlap between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals in Europe for about 6,000 years. Neanderthals do not seem to have been genocided by Homo sapiens. There certainly would have been competition between the two species, and perhaps a new, maybe more successful species did put pressure on local resources, which made it harder for Neanderthals to exist. And I'm certain there would have been smaller scale conflicts as well, which also would have removed very local populations of Neanderthals. But there is no active genocide of Neanderthals evidenced by the archaeology. Finally, there is the stressor of climate change. Neanderthals had experienced climate change throughout their evolutionary history, but perhaps this one bout of climate change was too much for Neanderthals. They weren't able to adapt quick enough to a rapidly changing environment. Around 40,000 years ago, which is when Neanderthals roughly disappear, there was an extreme cold event, and this would have brought below zero temperatures almost the entire year round, and this may have put stress on an already stressed population and may have further isolated the Neanderthals as well from one another, and they just weren't able to adapt quick enough to it. What combination of pressures did the Neanderthals in the end, we're not sure, but hopefully there will be research in the future that will be able to identify whether on the local, national, international level why Neanderthals went extinct. It'll also be very interesting to see if this applies to us in the modern day. I'll just wrap up my thoughts on the documentary and what we've gone over here then. I really enjoyed the documentary. I'm very glad that it was made and that they went and saw archaeologists doing some actual archaeology in the field, even though it was highly edited and those highly edited bits do leave out a lot of context. I really hope Netflix and other similar streaming services put more money into these types of documentaries, as they are a great way of showing the public archaeological information in a very digestible form, which I think, as I've always bandied on about, we fall down on that, those of us who work in the industry. We're really not very good at talking to the public about archaeology in an engaging format. I have harped on over and over again and been very critical of this documentary. It could have been much better, it did need more context, and it jumped around about sites and different topics, and they really need to tone down those edits. But overall, if you haven't watched it, I encourage you to do so, as it is a very visually pleasing documentary, and it does contain some very interesting cutting-edge information about the Neanderthals.